The cold concrete floor, which felt impersonal and alien, was his first memory. Not the first in his life, but the first in this new frightening world where smells were sharp and sounds were abrupt and loud. His name was Barney, though to be honest no one at the shelter knew that. For everyone he was just the puppy from kennel number 3. A small shadow that huddled with old woolen blankets that smelled of other dogs' fears and hopes. His days were a series of vague, repetitive events. The morning clang of bowls being filled with bland kibble, and short, hurried walks in the communal run where large shaggy dogs growled at each other, forcing him to hide in a corner to avoid conflict. And of course the long hours of waiting. This was perhaps the hardest part. The waiting filled every second as he curled up and watched the door leading to the big world. His world was actually limited to a few square feet of an old cage, where he shared space with 3 other puppies. But they were different. They played with each other, nipped at each other's ears, and seemed completely oblivious to what was happening beyond their little kingdom. Barney couldn't join them. His heart pounded in his throat, and his paws trembled when people entered the room. He knew they weren't here for him. They passed by without noticing him. Their eyes glided over him as if he were an empty space, as if he were just part of the decor, an unnecessary backdrop in their search for the perfect friend. The most terrifying part was that he didn't understand what he was doing wrong. His eyes were big and brown, and his fur was soft and fluffy. He was ready to love, ready to give all his tiny soul, but no one saw it. They saw only one more puppy, one of hundreds sitting in these cages. And this invisibility was more painful than any bite. When a person approached his kennel, he instinctively did what he thought would help. Slowly, with a tremble in his tiny body, he stretched a paw forward as if to say hello, to touch, to show that he was here, that he was waiting. But his paw remained in the air, and people simply walked past. Their conversations echoed in his ears, leaving only emptiness behind. He tried to attract their attention, whining softly, but his voice was lost in the general noise of the shelter. With each person who passed, his hope, a small smoldering ember, cooled, and his fear and confusion grew. These were his first days, filled with uncertainty and the endless waiting for a miracle that never happened. He didn't know what to do to get noticed, to finally be chosen. He just continued to stretch out his paw, like a small hopeless gesture in this indifferent world. Barney couldn't understand why people didn't notice him. He was like a little performer on an invisible stage, continuing to perform his only act. Each time footsteps approached his cage, he extended his paw. This gesture was no longer just an attempt to attract attention. It had become a ritual, a small daily prayer he offered to the world. At first, it was an unconscious movement, the instinct of a small creature seeking warmth and protection. But as days passed, the paw stretched out with a specific, almost ritualistic meaning. He learned to distinguish footsteps, the heavy tread of men, the light tap of women's heels, the shuffling of children's sneakers. Each sound had its own meaning, its own potential hope. When the steps were fast and purposeful, Barney didn't even lift his head. He knew these people were coming for a specific animal and had no time for casual glances. But when the steps slowed, when they approached neighboring kennels and a person lingered, he began his ritual. Slowly, with a tremor in his little body, he extended his paw. It was his way of saying, "I'm here, I'm a good boy. Please look at me." He watched the other puppies. They barked, jumped, and wagged their tails, creating a noise and commotion that seemed to attract more attention. Barney was not like that. He was quiet, timid. He believed that his quiet, sincere gesture would be more powerful, more convincing than any noise. He believed that someone would be able to see his true soul, his tiny but loving heart hidden behind his fear. Sometimes children would approach the kennel. Their ringing voices and innocent eyes gave him a fleeting flash of hope. Barney made a special effort for them. He didn't stretch out his paw. Instead, He cautiously pressed it against the bars of the cage as if to offer a handshake. But the children also passed by. Their parents hurried them along, and Barney was left alone with his unfulfilled ritual. His paw fell, and he curled up again, trying to calm his trembling. He started to notice that his ritual changed depending on the time of day. In the morning, when the shelter was filled with hustle and hope, his paw stretched out more confidently. In the evening, when the lights in the corridors dimmed and the footsteps became rarer, his gesture was more timid, almost hopeless. It was his own personal unspoken calendar, measuring not days but his fading hope. He didn't know that his ritual was unique. Other dogs, and even puppies, expressed themselves differently. Some whined plaintively, some jumped up and down trying to get attention. But Barney chose his own path. A path of quiet but persistent hope. He believed that in a world full of noise, his silent but sincere invitation would one day be heard. This ritual became his anchor in the stormy sea of shelter life. The only thing that gave him the strength to wake up every morning and wait for a new day. He simply couldn't stop, because to stop would mean to give up on himself, on his hope, on his dream of a home, which, although flickering dimly, still burned somewhere deep in his little soul. The paw that Barney extended was not just a gesture. It had become his language, his only way of communicating in a world where words were incomprehensible, and touch was a rare luxury. Every muscle, every cell in that little paw was filled with meaning. It was a language of the body, full of despair and hope, that he tried to convey to everyone who passed by. He pressed it against the bars of the cage, as if to break through the invisible wall separating him from people. Barney quickly realized that people didn't understand his words, his quiet whining, but they could understand what they saw. And he began to create his own vocabulary. His posture changed depending on who approached. When a young woman with kind but slightly sad eyes came, he tried to look especially small and defenseless, pressing his ears against his head. His paw seemed to be reaching not for attention but for comfort. When elderly people approached the kennel, he, on the contrary, straightened up, trying to show his strength and readiness to be a loyal friend. His paw at that moment was a gesture of respect and a promise. Sometimes he watched other dogs who seemed to know all the secrets of communicating with people. The big, shaggy dog from the neighboring kennel wagged its tail with such energy that its body seemed about to fall apart. The puppy who lived with him in the cage jumped and whined happily. Barney understood that this was their language, but he couldn't learn it. He wasn't like that. He was quiet, introspective, and his language was the same. He couldn't wag his tail that loudly because his heart was too frightened. He couldn't jump because he was afraid his jump would be ignored. He could only stretch out his paw slowly and persistently, like a flower reaching for the sun. He began to notice that his body language changed depending on his mood. On days when his hope was strong, his eyes glowed brighter, and his paw stretched out with confidence. On days of despair, when he felt that no one would ever come, his head dropped, and his paw only trembled faintly, as if he no longer believed in success but couldn't stop trying. He became a master of this silent language, his only means of connection with the world he so desperately wanted to be a part of. This body language was the only thing he had. He had no voice that could attract attention. He had no energy to jump and play. He had only this paw, this silent but meaningful gesture, which he repeated again and again, hoping that one day someone would decipher his message. And this waiting, this hope, captured in every movement of his body, became his essence, his main characteristic in this gray, indifferent world of the shelter. Barney's world was a world not only of visual but also auditory sensations. Trapped in his small cage, he couldn't see everything that was happening around him, but he could hear, and the sounds of the shelter became something like music to him, where every note had its own meaning. The morning began with a clang as shelter workers brought out large metal bowls. This sound was a signal that it was time for breakfast, and even though the food was monotonous, it still gave Barney an instinctive feeling of hope. The most frightening sound was the sharp, drawn-out squeal that the large iron door made when people entered the shelter. This sound was a harbinger of a visit, and Barney's paws would immediately start to tremble. Following this squeal were footsteps, and each step had its own tempo. The shelter workers moved quickly and confidently. Their steps were rhythmic and familiar. But the visitors' footsteps were different. They were hesitant, faltering, sometimes accompanied by whispers and laughter. And Barney learned to distinguish them. He knew that the slower and more uncertain the steps were, the greater the chance that people would stop at his cage. Voices also played a huge role. Rough and loud voices didn't attract his attention. He knew they belonged to people who came either just to look or for a large, strong dog. But when he heard soft, gentle voices, especially women's or children's, his heart began to beat faster. He would whine softly, trying to join this auditory dialogue. He wanted his voice to be a part of this world, a part of this possible new life. Besides human sounds, the shelter was full of other noises. Loud barking, howling, whining. All of this was part of the general choir. Barney learned to recognize emotions in these sounds. The joyful bark when someone was taken away. The loud, desperate howl when someone was left alone. He heard the sadness and longing in the voices of other dogs, and it made him feel even more lonely. But there were also sounds that gave him hope. It was the quiet, happy yelping of puppies who were finally being taken home. He heard them leaving the shelter, and this sound, although it made him feel sad, at the same time gave him hope. He understood that it was possible for him too. Thus, his world was invisible but audible. He perceived it through the prism of sounds, which became his only source of information about the outside world. He listened to footsteps, voices, the squeal of doors, and knew that behind every sound was a story. A story of hope, waiting, disappointment, or on the contrary, happiness. And every day, listening to this chorus, he continued his small ritual, stretching out his paw, hoping that one day someone would hear his silent call, which was just as strong as all the sounds that filled this shelter. From behind the bars of his cage, Barney became an unwilling observer. He saw dozens, if not hundreds, of human pairs who came to the shelter in search of a friend. Over time, he began to notice patterns, as if studying a complex science, the psychology of choice. He saw how people chose and, most importantly, why. He understood that choice was rarely accidental. Most people came with a preformed image of an ideal pet. Some were looking for an energetic puppy who could run with them in the mornings. They passed by, barely glancing at Barney, who, curled up, looked too calm. Their eyes searched for noise, commotion, that very frantic energy that was so far from his quiet nature. Others were looking for a small, fluffy companion who would fit on their laps. But even then, they chose the more active and sociable puppies from his kennel. Barney was too shy, too frightened to jump and wag his tail like his neighbors. He saw how some people chose dogs that resembled their past pets. He heard their conversations. "Oh, he's just like our old Max." And these words, full of nostalgia, flew past him because he wasn't like Max or anyone else. He was just himself, a small, scared puppy who didn't yet have his own story for someone to remember. The biggest mystery to him were those people who didn't choose at all. They came, spent long hours watching every dog, but left empty-handed. In their eyes, Barney saw longing but no determination. He didn't understand what they were looking for, but he knew that he wasn't what they wanted to find. Maybe they weren't looking for a dog but for some feeling, some lost part of themselves, and none of the shelter residents could give it to them. He also noticed that people often chose with their eyes. They would approach the kennels and assess their appearance without trying to look deeper. Barney understood that he wasn't the most beautiful puppy. His fur wasn't as fluffy as the others, and his eyes, full of fear, didn't sparkle with happiness like the eyes of his cellmates. He tried to convey to them that he wasn't what they thought, that behind his modest appearance was a huge loving heart, but his message remained silent. Barney didn't know that people chose not only with their hearts but also with their minds. They thought about their apartments, their lifestyle, their financial capabilities. They made choices based on practicality, not emotions. And in this practical, logical system, there was no place for Barney. He was too unknown, too unpredictable. He was a little dark horse that no one dared to choose. And this experience, these observations, made him even more lonely, even more confident in his invisibility. He understood that his paw, his only gesture, was powerless against this complex, illogical psychology of choice. Remaining alone in the cage when the other puppies finally fell asleep, Barney began his inner dialogue. These were the moments when he could be himself, without fear and without the need to stretch out his paw. His thoughts were his only protection, his only true home. He reflected on the world, on people, on himself. He wondered why he was here and what he had done wrong. He tried to analyze every one of his steps, every one of his attempts to understand why he remained invisible. Maybe I'm not beautiful enough, he thought, examining his paw. Maybe my fur is too simple or my eyes are too sad? These questions swirled in his head like tiny obsessive gnats. He compared himself to other puppies who were fluffier, more energetic, more standard. He didn't understand that uniqueness isn't always a disadvantage. He started to talk to himself. These weren't words but rather feelings formed into thoughts. He comforted himself, promised himself that tomorrow would be better, that someone would definitely come tomorrow who would see him. He painted pictures of the future in his imagination. A warm home, a soft rug, loving hands that stroked his head. These pictures were so vivid, so real that for a moment he forgot about the cold cage. Sometimes his inner monologue was filled with despair. He asked himself questions for which there were no answers. Why me? Why am I here? Do I deserve this? These thoughts were heavy, and they weighed on him, forcing him to curl into an even tighter ball. But even in the darkest moments, he didn't completely lose hope. Deep in his small heart, there always remained a tiny spark that told him that it wasn't over yet. This inner world became his salvation. It was a sanctuary where his paw wasn't rejected, where his eyes weren't ignored. In this world, he was the hero of his own story, and he believed that one day this story would go beyond the confines of his cage. He learned to be strong, to be patient, to be himself. He understood that even if no one saw him, he still existed. And his thoughts, his feelings, his hopes, they were real. And this realization gave him the strength to wake up every morning and, despite everything, stretch out his paw again. Continuing his lonely life in the shelter, Barney gradually realized that his hopes, like leaves in the wind, were changing their shape and size. The big, bold dreams of being chosen first, of happily running away to a new home, began to dim and give way to smaller, more realistic desires. It was a hierarchy of hopes that he built in his little heart to survive. At first, his greatest hope was in every new visitor. He believed that anyone who walked through that door would stop at his cage, see him and take him home. He stretched his paw out to everyone indiscriminately, believing that his simple gesture would be understood. This was his main hope, his brightest dream. But after hundreds of passing feet, dozens of indifferent glances, his main hope began to lose its strength. He no longer believed that he would be taken by the first person to come along. Now his hope shifted to a different level. He began to distinguish people, their moods, their intentions. His hope became more selective. He no longer stretched his paw out to those who walked quickly or looked too busy. Now he waited. He waited for those who slowed their steps, who spoke softly, who looked at him for more than a second. His hope became more purposeful, but it still remained fragile. When this hope began to fade, he went even lower on his hierarchy. Now his hopes became very small, almost unnoticeable. He began to appreciate the brief moments that gave him small joys. He hoped that today his walk in the run would be a little longer. He hoped that the shelter worker who brought the food would pet him on the head. He hoped that the sun would shine brighter today and warm the cold concrete of his cage. These little hopes were like tiny flickering lights in the darkness. They couldn't illuminate his whole life, but they gave him the strength to last one more day. It was a kind of defense mechanism. He learned not to dream of the impossible so as not to be disappointed again and again. He learned to find happiness in the small things because that was all that was available to him. He understood that he might never be destined to leave this shelter, and his greatest hope for a home might remain unfulfilled. But he didn't allow this thought to break him. He simply changed the rules of the game. He began to value moments, not the future. And in this small, quiet acceptance of his fate, in this hierarchy of hopes, he found his own special kind of strength and wisdom. For Barney, life in the shelter was an endless present. But sometimes, in the quietest moments, fragments of memories surfaced from the depths of his consciousness. They weren't clear, complete pictures but rather smells, sounds, and sensations that reminded him of a life before. He didn't know who his real parents were, but he remembered the warmth of a large, soft body he used to press against when he was very tiny. This smell of mother's milk and warm fur was his first, most important memory. It was an anchor that kept him from complete despair, reminding him that he had once been loved. He remembered a touch, not the slow, deliberate stroking of a shelter worker, but the gentle, confident hands that picked him up. He didn't remember the face or the voice, but the feeling of those hands, their warmth and strength, was etched in his memory forever. Sometimes, when he saw people gently petting other puppies, he instinctively closed his eyes, trying to reclaim that forgotten feeling. It was so strong that for a second he felt like he was back there safe and warm. The brightest and at the same time most painful memory was a sound. It was not a bark, not the creak of a door, but a quiet, monotonous sound, like music that someone was humming. It was a kind of child's babbling, full of love and tenderness. Barney didn't know what the sound was, but he associated it with a sense of safety and happiness. When he heard children at the shelter talking to their future pets, he strained his little ears, trying to catch the familiar melody. And although he never found it, this search gave him hope. He understood that love was more than just food and a warm place. It was a sound, a touch, a feeling that he once knew and was desperately trying to get back. These memories were his little personal treasure trove. They were his story which, although incomplete and vague, made him special. They gave him the strength to believe that the world was not always like it was in the shelter, that somewhere beyond these walls, there was another life where he would be loved, where he would be remembered. These memories were his fuel, his reason for continuing to stretch out his paw despite everything. He wasn't just looking for a home. He was looking for a return to that past that he only remembered in fragments, but which was the most precious thing to him. He was looking for the love he had once lost, and that feeling was stronger than any despair. Life in the shelter was lonely, but Barney was not completely alone. In his small world, confined by the bars of the cage, there were other creatures, his cellmates. At first, he didn't pay attention to them, too immersed in his own fears and hopes, but over time, he realized that they were his only allies, his family in this alien, indifferent world. He lived in a kennel with 3 other puppies. One of them, small and fluffy with floppy ears, was constantly jumping and playing. He was a perpetual optimist who never seemed to lose hope. His name was Toby. Another, named Rex, was larger and calmer. He always slept in the corner, but when the other puppies started to fight, he would quietly intervene, breaking them up. The third, a small, timid female named Lily, was like Barney. She was also afraid of people and hid in the corner. But sometimes, when Barney felt especially lonely, she would crawl over to him and whine softly as if to say, "I'm here, I'm with you." Barney didn't play with them the way they played with each other. He was too withdrawn to join their noisy games, but he communicated with them in his own way. He learned to understand them without words, through glances, through movements. When Toby joyfully wagged his tail, Barney knew it was time to eat. When Lily hid in the corner, he knew she was scared. They were his mirror, his reflection, and in their eyes he saw himself. The most important one to him was Lily. They were two sides of the same coin, both scared, both lonely, both looking for love. They didn't play or fight. They just sat side by side, huddled against each other. And in that silence was the most genuine, most profound friendship. It was not just physical warmth. It was an understanding that didn't need words. It was the feeling that you weren't alone, that someone else felt the same way you did. This friendship gave Barney strength. It was his protection from complete despair. He knew that even if no human chose him, he would always have Lily, with whom he could share his fear and his hope. This friendship behind bars was his secret treasure, his little miracle in this gray, cold world. It was proof that even in the most difficult circumstances, you can find love and support. And that realization gave him the strength to not give up, to continue his ritual, and to believe in a better future. Barney stopped just waiting. He started to contemplate. The long hours alone gave him the opportunity to delve into deep thoughts about the meaning of hope and patience. He realized that waiting was not just a passive state, but an active, conscious process. It was his personal philosophical path to survival. He reflected on what hope was. At first, he thought that hope was the certainty that he would be taken home tomorrow. But when that tomorrow never came, he realized that hope was not a specific outcome but the process of waiting itself. It was the belief not in what would happen but in what could happen. It was the realization that the possibility of a miracle existed, and that possibility was enough to not give up. He realized that hope was a fire inside him that he himself had to keep burning. Patience became a supreme virtue for him. He learned to see it not as a weakness but as a strength. Patience allowed him not to succumb to despair, not to go crazy from the monotony of the days. He understood that patience was the ability to accept reality as it was, without losing faith in a better future. He began to observe nature, how the grass grew slowly, how the parched earth patiently waited for rain. He saw a reflection of his own life in this. His reflections led him to another discovery. He realized that the invisibility that had tormented him for so long was not a curse but a kind of test. He understood that if he had been taken on the very first day, he might never have become who he was now. He would not have learned patience, would not have found the strength within himself, would not have understood what true friendship with Lily was. He realized that his loneliness had made him stronger, deeper, and wiser. He became a little philosopher in a dog's body who was comprehending the mysteries of existence while sitting in his cage. He accepted his situation, but he did not resign himself to it. It was a fine line that he learned to feel. He accepted that he was here now in the shelter, but he never stopped believing that another life awaited him. He continued his ritual, but now he did it not with despair but with wisdom. He stretched out his paw not because he hoped for an immediate result, but because it was a part of him, a part of his philosophy of waiting. And in this lay his true strength, his truly unconquerable hope. Despite all his wisdom and philosophy, Barney remained a puppy, and even in his small, resilient heart, there were moments when faith almost completely disappeared. These were not just days when no one came. These were critical points when the hope he had so carefully nurtured seemed to evaporate, leaving behind only a bitter emptiness. One of those moments came when Toby, his cheerful and energetic cellmate, was chosen. Barney watched as a joyful couple, a young woman and a man, approached their cage. Toby, as always, was jumping and barking with delight. The woman was smiling, and the man took a ball out of his pocket. Barney, holding his breath, waited for them to look at him too. He didn't even stretch out his paw. He just watched them play with Toby. And then, after a few minutes, the woman opened the cage, picked Toby up, and they left. The door slammed shut. The silence that followed their departure was deafening. It wasn't just a farewell. It was the realization that someone else had been chosen, and he had been left behind again. He felt something inside him break. Another moment of despair was related to Lily. She, like him, was quiet and shy, and they were each other's only comfort. But one day, a family with a little girl approached their cage. The girl held out her hand and Lily, for the first time in a long time, didn't hide. She cautiously walked over to the girl and licked her little finger. It was such a gentle, such a touching moment. Barney froze, his heart was beating at a frantic pace. He was so happy for Lily, but at the same time he felt a pang of pain. The girl asked her parents to take Lily, and they agreed. When Lily left, she looked at Barney, and there was so much fear and so much hope in her eyes. Barney was left alone. His only friend was gone, and he felt like the loneliest puppy in the whole world. His paw, which he had been stretching for so long, seemed to grow heavier. He lay down on the floor, curled up, and just lay there, not moving until he fell asleep. These moments were not just painful. They were critical. They called his entire philosophy, all his faith, into question. They made him doubt what he was doing, whether his ritual had any meaning at all. He felt that his small spark of hope might go out forever. But even in these seemingly hopeless situations, something inside him would not allow him to give up completely. Something that was stronger than despair. The time he spent at the shelter was not in vain. In addition to his philosophical reflections, Barney developed an amazing ability. He learned to read people like an open book. His intuition sharpened to the limit, and he began to recognize signs and premonitions that escaped others. His paw no longer reached out to everyone, but only to those whom his inner voice called a possibility. He learned to recognize not only footsteps but their rhythm. The steps of a person walking thoughtlessly were fast and monotonous. The steps of someone who was searching were slow and intermittent. But there were other steps, those that belonged to people who came to the shelter not because they needed something but because their heart led them there. These steps were soft, full of hope, and Barney felt them even before he saw the person. He learned to read eyes. Most people looked at him but didn't see him. They saw only the image of a puppy in a cage, but some looked differently. There was no judgment or comparison in their eyes. There was compassion, empathy. These were eyes that saw not just an animal but a soul seeking salvation. Barney could feel this look from afar. And when he saw such eyes, he knew it was his chance. His premonitions became his only tool for survival. He learned to feel people. When a car pulled up to the shelter, he could tell by the sound who would get out of it. A family with children, a young couple, or a single person. He didn't know how it worked, but his intuition was infallible. He felt people's energy, their aura. He knew that some people came to save and some to find. He waited for those who wanted to save. His ritual, his paw, also changed. Now he no longer just stretched it out. He did it consciously, directing his gesture toward specific people. He was waiting for that special person. He could pass by dozens of indifferent glances, but when his intuition signaled the right one, his paw stretched with a strength and confidence that he had not had before. He knew that this gesture might be his last, his only chance, and he didn't want to waste it on those who would not be able to understand him. His life turned into a game where he was a hunter for signs, and he believed that one day he would find what he was looking for. The days, weeks, and months in the shelter did not break Barney. They changed him. He was no longer the scared, timid puppy who first entered the cage. The internal changes were deep, and they touched his very essence. He survived despair, loneliness, and pain, and these experiences forged a new character in him. First of all, he learned to be independent, and he no longer needed to huddle against other puppies to feel safe. He began to trust himself, his inner voice, and his intuition. His quiet nature did not disappear, but it was filled with inner strength and serenity. He no longer whined or whimpered. He just waited with a dignity that was uncharacteristic of such a small creature. His gaze also changed. Before, his eyes had only fear and confusion. Now they had a depth, a wisdom that could only be found in those who had gone through difficult trials. He looked at the world not as a victim but as an observer, a philosopher. His eyes were a mirror of his soul, and in them one could read his whole story. The biggest change was his paw. It ceased to be a gesture of despair. Now, when he stretched it out, it was not a cry for help but an invitation. It was an offer of friendship, love, and loyalty. His paw became a symbol of his resilience, his hope, and his readiness to give everything he had to the one who would finally see him. This gesture was not just a movement. It was a promise he was making to the world. He became different, but he did not stop being himself. He remained Barney, but now his name was filled with new meaning. He was a symbol of survival, a symbol of hope, a symbol of the fact that even in the darkest places, one can find light. He was living proof that pain can make you stronger, that loneliness can teach you wisdom, and that waiting can give you patience. And he was ready for his new life. He was ready for his person. One day he felt it. It was something more than just the sound of footsteps or a glance. It was a feeling that penetrated through the walls of the shelter, through the bars of his cage, straight into his heart. It was a premonition that was stronger than all his previous intuitive hunches. That day, a woman entered the shelter. Her steps were neither fast nor slow. They were confident and calm. In her eyes there was neither curiosity nor compassion. There was an emptiness that was so similar to the one Barney felt inside himself. She didn't look at the kennels with greed or curiosity. She just walked like a ghostly shadow. And Barney felt that she wasn't looking for a puppy. She was looking for someone who could fill her inner emptiness. Her gaze stopped on him, and at that moment something changed. A spark flashed in her eyes that was like his own. She saw him. She saw him not just as a puppy but as a being with a history, with pain, with hope. She saw his soul. Barney couldn't explain how he knew it, but he did. He knew that this person was his. She approached his cage and crouched down. There was no smile in her eyes, but there was a tenderness that was stronger than any smile. She didn't reach out her hand to him. She just looked at him. And Barney, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel fear. He felt trust. He realized that this woman was his person. He slowly, with dignity, extended his paw. It was not a gesture of despair. It was a greeting. She was not frightened. She did not walk by. She carefully took his paw in her hand. Her touch was warm and confident. At that moment, Barney felt something inside him that had been frozen begin to thaw. She didn't say a word. She just held his paw in hers. And Barney realized that she was not looking for the perfect puppy. She was looking for someone who could understand her. And she found him in him. It was the intuition of love that told them both that they were one. Two lonely hearts that had finally found each other. He left the shelter and the world changed. The cold concrete gave way to soft green grass. The sharp smells of the shelter were replaced by the fresh scent of flowers and earth. The deafening barking of other dogs subsided and was replaced by silence, interrupted only by the singing of birds. He was free, but most importantly, he was not alone. His new life was filled with miracles. He discovered new sensations. For the first time, he felt the warmth of the sun playing on his fur. For the first time, he breathed in the smell of rain that washed away the dust of the past. For the first time, he tasted food that was not just kibble but a treat. But the greatest miracle was the home. A home that was not just a roof over his head but a place where he felt safe. His person, that woman with sad but understanding eyes, turned out to be as quiet and calm as he was. She didn't force him to play or demand stormy emotions from him. She was just there. She petted him and there was no pity in her touch, only love. She talked to him and her voice was as soft as silk, filled with tenderness and understanding. Barney, in turn, didn't ask anything of her. He was just there, and his presence was a comfort to her. He no longer stretched out his paw. That gesture became part of his past, a symbol of his struggle, his waiting. Now he just lay at her feet, curled up, feeling her warmth and her love. He realized that his paw, which he had been stretching out to the world for so long, had found its place. It was in his person's hand, as a symbol of their silent but deep understanding. Barney's new life was not just about comfort. It was about trust, healing, and love. He learned to trust, learned to love, learned to be happy. He was no longer a puppy from a shelter. He was Barney, loved, wanted, and home. He was proof that hope, however faint, can lead to a miracle. He found his home, his person, and finally found what he had been looking for his whole life: quiet, peaceful happiness.